Hi, We Teach Well welcomes you to this discussion, part of the Victorian Government's Digital Innovation Futures Festival for 2023. Whether you're watching this now or later on demand, we're really thrilled that you've tuned in. Shortly, I'm going to introduce you to some amazing educators who've been working and doing work in the area of out-of-field teaching. Can I first ask the panelists if they mind very much if I use their first names? There are some hefty professional titles here, and I know I'll get tongue-tied. The correct info will be on the event information on the website. So I hope that's okay with all of you. Before we begin, We Teach Well acknowledges the sovereignty of the traditional custodians of the lands where we live and work. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that the land is and will always be Aboriginal land. As an education business, We Teach Well recognises the value of traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island education systems and promotes increased Aboriginal involvement in education at a state and federal level. First, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Linda Hobbs from Deakin School of Education. Linda's PhD highlighted the lack of research into the out-of-field teaching phenomena and the need to carefully conceptualise what is occurring for out-of-field science and maths teachers. Working in the area of initial teacher education, what we often refer to as ITE, she is active in researching the role of universities in preparing teachers in their transitions into the profession when learning to teach out of field. This point has some significant policy implications. I also believe I saw that Linda convenes a global body of educators researching in this field. Dr. Lucinda McKnight, I believe, also from Deakin, Lucinda, is a senior lecturer in pedagogy and curriculum at Deakin. Lucinda conducts award-winning research into curriculum design's role in teacher identity, autonomy, and professionalism, especially in English, a woman after my own heart. She is interested in creative teacher and student agency and in teacher recruitment and retention in a time of extreme teacher shortages. The recruitment and retention of teachers is significantly affected by teachers having to teach out of field. Next is Dr. Susan Caldas. Is that the correct way of saying it, Susan?
Yep, that's fun. Yep.
From Macquarie University. Susan's PhD related to her subject, geography, as it's taught across secondary and initial teacher education contexts. When I saw a LinkedIn post that she had submitted her thesis and mentioned the problem of out-of-field teaching, I knew I wanted to connect with her. Currently, her research focuses on understanding how the experience of transitioning into the teaching profession influences professional practice of teachers, particularly in the secondary geography classroom, but also how pre-service and early career teachers manage and respond to teaching out of field as a reality of entering the profession. It's no secret that there's a double whammy often with out of field teaching, in that it's often given to new young teachers who are just entering the profession. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Ruth Smith. I first met Ruth during an online teleconference when she told me that she'd been an out-of-field English teacher for 20 years. We've had many conversations about this over the last couple of years. Ruth is the MYP, that's Middle Years Program Coordinator and Head of Program Teaching and Learning at Callum Vale Community College in Queensland, one of only a very few public schools to run the International Baccalaureate program. Ruth has become really well skilled in the areas of e-learning, educational technology, and instructional design, something that has become very much more common in the last 3 years. And finally, I'd like to introduce Michaela Epstein from Maths Teachers Circles. Again, did I say it wrong? Right? Cool. Michaela is the founder and director of Maths Teachers Circles in Australia. She's a maths educator, deeply committed to sharing great maths ideas with others. With the belief that professional learning should be inspiring, she founded Maths Circles in 2020. Since then, over 700 teachers, academics, and other maths enthusiasts from across Australia and overseas have come together to enjoy maths and to learn from one another. However, as in anything, the ability to be inspiring often depends on being well-grounded in the foundations of your subject, and out-of-field teachers don't have that. So to begin, perhaps, Linda, you could give us a bit of an outline on what we mean when we talk about out-of-field teaching and what its implications can be.
Thanks, Caroline. Well, out-of-field teaching, it's also called being an unspecialised or non-specialist teacher. It basically refers to a teacher who doesn't have the qualifications or background in the subject that they're required to teach or teaching. So it could relate to the particular discipline area, but more recently, it's also relating to the phase or the stage of schooling. So you can have out-of-field teachers who feel out-of-field when they're teaching secondary school subjects, when they're actually primary trained, etc. So it ultimately relates to both qualification, and that's the technical definitions based on a qualification and whether that the qualification matches the subject or their assigned role in the school in terms of their teaching. But other ways of thinking about it is more qualitative and focuses on how they feel about teaching out of field. So it's the out of fieldness. So how capable they feel. For example, Ruth, who's been teaching English out of field for 20 years, would you still call Ruth out of field? So it comes down to not just that technical definition, but also the suitability. So principals will actually talk about how suitable a teacher is to that particular assigned role in the school. Okay.
If you were looking at, say, maths, it's interesting you said non-specialist, because one of the issues from English and maths teachers, of course, is that they are often called non-specialist in schools, which means that, if you have a teaching qualification, you can teach them because they're not specialist. How would you respond to that?
So you mean that they haven't specialised in their teacher training in a particular area, so that you'd call that generalist, I think. So yeah, so in some states they'll talk about being unspecialised to mean that they're not specialised to teach that particular subject. Or more common, you'll hear, I'm a maths specialist, I'm a specialised maths teacher. So it recognises this notion of specialisation. Out of field is sort of a term that's been introduced, but it's actually not widely understood in the Australian context.
Yeah. As an English teacher, Lucinda, with a background in English teaching and being aware that out of field teaching has been very much common in English classrooms for as long as I have been a teacher, how do you think that idea of specialization or not being sort of specialized to that role has affected English, the teaching of English, and how teachers manage?
Well, I think any sort of language that suggests anyone can teach a subject at secondary level is very problematic for a discipline, and has no doubt thrown up challenges over time with people just being assumed that anyone can teach English. So, you have people thrown in at the deep end when perhaps they're their own methods that they have specialised in have been completely different, not even necessarily aligned in any way, shape or form. So I do think that that has potentially created problems in particular for English, especially when you have sort of people thinking, well, everyone can read and everyone can write. Well, all teachers can, hopefully, so anyone can do that subject. But it's a very superficial sort of understanding of what the discipline of English is and the incredible complexity of it. I'm sure Ruth would probably agree there too, hopefully.
Your thoughts, Ruth?
Yes, I completely agree. I actually am a secondary trained teacher in music and humanities, particularly in history, modern and ancient. And I actually became a primary teacher. So I was both out of field teaching English and out of phase, because my qualifications are actually in secondary, particularly focused on middle years. And it was actually only through the support of my colleagues and being able to work with collaboratively with teachers in a staff room where, you know, lunch conversations were about the teaching of senior English and how to go about that, and all of the materials and the processes that go into that, and the levels of analysis that are required. That was the support that I received. There wasn't certainly anything formal or any connections outside that. So, you know, the depth and complexity happened, I guess, through collaborative planning formally, but also informally. And I think a lot of schools perhaps put reliance on that informal nature, that, you know, just because we put them in an English staff room with a bunch of English people, then they're going to, by a process of osmosis, absorb that information. And that's not necessarily always the case. People need a lot more support than something that's ad hoc and, you know, relies on the professionalism and collegiality of other teachers to support them.
Do you think that collegiality and, well, do you think it's available? Not that it's not, that teachers don't want to help, but do you think under current situations in schools that availability of assistance and help is actually there, or is it a bit harder now?
In some cases, it is a bit harder now. My school, just like every other school, is being impacted by teacher shortages, and more of our teachers are teaching out of area, not just in English, but in visual arts. So many other, certainly in geography, many people are not. I think we've got 2 qualified geography teachers and possibly 2 qualified history teachers. So humanities for us is something that is quite, you know, a lot of people teach out of field there. It also depends on structures. So my school is very big. We've got over 2,500 students from prep to year 12. We've recently restructured our staff rooms to be faculty based rather than house based, because we wanted those conversations to be able to take place, those informal subject conversations to be able to take place between teachers when they have the time. So there are structures involved with that. But also people are so busy, and your spares might not necessarily line up with somebody else's spares. You don't necessarily have the same lunch breaks because you've got duty. There's meetings after school. There's so many other obligations and demands on teachers' time during the school day that it can be very difficult to actually find the time beyond the you know, planned collaborative planning time to be able to do that. And many of our teachers also teach multiple subjects. So, you know, if I'm teaching both English and geography and the collaborative planning is scheduled at the same time, I might not necessarily be able to get to both meetings, and I have to catch up later on to be able to do that. We actually find that we use Microsoft Teams at school and minute all of our meetings and share resources and things like that in that way. So having the support of technology to be able to do that really does help when you can't always attend. We also offer things like, you know, Teams meetings. So if you're offsite or at home or whatever, you can still join via video link with Teams. So technology does support it to a certain extent. So with systems and tools, that collegiality is possible, but yeah, the demands of assessment and curriculum and all those sorts of things on teachers is really quite big in schools.
Yeah, so just to add to that about culture, it's to do with a culture of sharing as well through any means, technological or other. And there are, in education at the moment, there are a lot of very individualistic sort of discourses going around. So I presented recently at a professional learning session day, and I asked I asked the people leading it how what I was presenting was going to be disseminated amongst teachers at the schools. And the answer to that was, oh no, we don't want people sharing this research. This is just for them, them individually, and they have achieved their funding based on this being for them individually. Because if they try to apply for discipline specific, funding or professional learning, they're told, no, you can't go to that because we want what you do to, if you go to something that you say you'll disseminate to others, we want it to be something on something generic. So there are all these sort of pressures within schools that can work against out-of-field teachers. So it's great to hear that Ruth has got that technological support and that culture there, because some schools don't have that.
As an IB school, it's actually a requirement. So we have to be able to evidence collaborative planning, and that means sharing ideas internally, but also externally, to be able to connect with schools in Australia, but also overseas. So that's a given in our school, and it must happen. We have to be able to show that.
To both Linda and Michaela, in regards to maths. So when I started to get interested in what we could do about out-of-field teaching, I had conversations with the deputy principal, and I was in Queensland at the time. And she was from a maths background. And she said that her problem was that according to the Queensland system at the time, both maths and English teachers were counted as generalist. And so therefore, they could be moved around. I would imagine that for maths, for English, those very foundation years of 7, 8, 9 are really important. And I would imagine they would be the same for maths. So how does that, do you have thoughts on how that idea of generalist has particularly difficult problems for maths teachers and maths teaching, and teachers who have to teach maths who never did maths at uni or at any time?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on this. So just to clarify, you're saying people, these generalist teachers in Queensland, there were people without a maths background being asked to go in and teach maths.
Yeah.
Yes. Lucinda mentioned about English, that people who go in as out-of-field teachers tend to have a superficial understanding of the discipline. And it's exactly the same with maths. I think there's a lot of views that, you can chuck a textbook into the classroom or plug and play with some tech program and then you're covered for maths. But actually, in particular in those early years of secondary schools, students need very close support with developing conceptual understanding in key areas. Place value, multiplicative thinking, and all of the concepts that go on from that, spatial reasoning, problem solving. These are skills that often students have gaps in from earlier years of primary school, and they're very difficult to diagnose and to then piece together to be able to layer on the more complex skills and knowledge that follows through in secondary. And without that very careful support in year 7, 8, and 9, students struggle. And you typically see that students who've started to struggle in primary school, if they don't close those gaps in early secondary, they continue to struggle, but maths becomes incredibly confusing. It becomes about memorizing sets of rules and procedures instead of piecing together knowledge in a way that makes sense. And so students get turned off. And I think we have this longer term flow-on effect into the later years of secondary, and we've seen it in the data that the uptake of more advanced levels of maths in senior secondary has been declining. And that's not going to turn around if we're not supporting them in the earlier years of secondary with the knowledge and with the confidence in their own capacities.
A question that I always ask or try to get some traction on is, so you've mentioned about maths, the difficulties in the lower years, 7 to 9. Lucinda talked about English. Now there's something that happens in years 7 and 9, some strange thing where they test students in something that has to do with literacy and numeracy, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense if they're the years that those students don't have qualified teachers. Is that possibly something we should be thinking about when we look at results from things like NAPLAN?
I would say absolutely. And I was actually thinking in the lead into this conversation today about how the issue of out of field teaching is not consistently distributed across schools.
No.
We know that there are schools that are far, far more impacted. I started teaching in Mildura, which is in rural Victoria. And the whole time I was at that school, we had a shortage of maths teachers. And our principal wrote to every university in Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia, asking for maths teachers with all sorts of financial incentives to bring them there. And we just couldn't get the teachers. So, you know, those sorts of schools, they have to go above and beyond in those contexts to close the gap. In what are already often quite trying circumstances, you know, there are students with additional needs coming in. And so, yes, absolutely, when we're looking at the results of standardized testing, we need to take into consideration these additional complications that certain schools are facing.
And
Yeah,
I just want to jump in and just say about NAPLAN. I think NAPLAN is a really good example of dangers and risks for out-of-field teachers, especially in relation to English. NAPLAN is not an unproblematic thing that can just be assumed to be some kind of neutral test. In English, in particular, the writing test in NAPLAN has been found by numerous studies and researchers to be found to be utterly flawed and completely not fit for purpose. It reduces the learning in English down to a really pointless performativity where they're getting students, the NAPLAN test gets students to write for no given purpose and no given audience. Just a completely pointless piece of writing. And for out-of-field teachers to look at NAPLAN and think that that is somehow exemplary of what good writing might potentially be is really risky. And out-of-field teachers don't necessarily know the incredible debates that happen inside the disciplines. You know, NAPLAN has been being fervently resisted from inside the English discipline ever since its inception, and it's been proven, it's been demonstrated to actually harm how both teachers and students are thinking. So it has pedagogical harms, it has actual writing outcome harms for students. And so we can't look to those tests and think, oh, what might they show, as if what those tests show is actually meaningful. Because in some cases, especially in English, it's not. But how are out-of-field teachers meant to navigate the politics of things like NAPLAN that might potentially guide their practice?
Thank
There's
you.
been some, sorry, I'll just sort of go off the back of some of the things that Michaela was saying. And the potential damage that it can have, particularly in maths teaching. So there has been some research done around the world on outcomes for students. There's not a lot, actually, but there's been some that's come out of Texas recently, who by researchers who are using very large data sets. This is whole state data sets of yearly student achievement in maths and a range of maths areas. Now, this is I stress really large data sets, and what they're finding is that the student achievement of teachers, of students who are taught by out-of-field teachers, perform less than teachers who have just walked in off the street. literally. So we don't have that same issue here in Australia, because we always have, our teachers have some, at least a permission to teach, and there's some rigorous control. However, it does indicate that there is something happening for out of field teachers that makes it very difficult for them to maintain quality teaching. They might be great teachers in their in-field area, and with time and support, they could actually be great maths teachers or great teachers in those subject areas. But it does come back to that notion of risk, that you are putting a teacher in front of the students who may not be familiar with the content or the pedagogies well enough to be able to maintain the quality education that we expect.
Oh, and Linda, that reminds me too, sorry, just to add to what Linda said there, that we have a lot of evidence in English teaching that English teachers who identify as writers are better teachers of writing. So that's well known. That's the fundamental basis of the whole national writing project in the UK, USA, and New Zealand as well.
Before
But
sorry, go on.
No, that's okay. I was like, I'm going to jump in now.
Okay, good, because I was going to throw to you in a minute anyway. So
That's okay. That's okay. I was just going to pick up on this idea of risk, and also kind of link together what Ruth and Michaela were talking about as well. But obviously for me, it's wrapped around geography and the pre-service teachers. And I guess in my research, I didn't set out to research out of field teaching sort of in its own right. It was something that emerged really strongly as I was researching transition into the profession, and discovered that whilst the pre-service teacher group that I was working with, who were all training to be geographers, not only on their professional experience, but also as part of their casual employment before they finished their degree and became, a fully fledged teacher in their own right, that this out of field teaching phenomenon for them was really prevalent. And they, in the geography methodology units that these pre-service group had been doing, they'd been interrogating what we call the distinctive core of the subject. So we've been looking at the foundational concepts, the particular pedagogies associated with the teaching of geography. And when these pre-service teachers were exposed to teaching another subject that wasn't always within a humanities faculty, sometimes it was outside it and, very, very removed from a HISI lens, they took these ideas about, well, if geography has some key concepts, and if geography has field work, for example, as a key way of doing geography, then surely there's something similar that's happening in agriculture or technologies or commerce or whatever the subject was that they were teaching. And so they were sort of taking the process of being able to find out what was distinctive about geography and asking the right questions of those who were more proficient in teaching the out of field subject. We also worked through a series of what we called social labs, where we unpacked the experience of what it was like to transition into the teaching profession. And they all realised through their discussions with each other that this was something they were all experiencing. And so then it kind of normalised it a little bit for them, and together they could kind of work through some strategies. And I guess this idea, they all mentioned that, being able to understand that every subject has something particular to it, and being able to ask others, join professional associations, join online, Facebook groups and similar, to try and draw out what those facets might be and then start to implement them in their practice, was all noted as something that really helped them and that they felt supported through doing. And in my current research at the moment, I'm working with a group of economics and business studies and history teachers who are required to teach geography out of field. And this is where I guess the scale aspect comes in, because these teachers are trained in humanities subjects. It's just their combination doesn't happen to include geography, but they're required to teach it because in New South Wales, geography is core learning up to year 10. So every humanities Yeah, thank you. Every humanities teacher is likely at some point to teach a year 7 to 10 geography class, whether it's part of their, specialisation combination or not. And again, we're working through these social labs of being able to understand what's distinctive in your specialist subject, and then take those ideas and the questions to ask to try and unpack some of the distinctive concepts and ways of knowing and doing the subject that you're now required to teach. So I just wanted to add that in the mix as well, because not only with the risk of sort of the high stakes testing and out of field teaching within service teachers, we're also grappling with more and more, I think, this reality that pre-service teachers during their professional experience, as well as upon their entry to the profession before they're fully released, are also experiencing the out of field phenomenon.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that briefly, to the geography part of that, because I loved geography at high school. I thought it was really interesting. But when later on in some of my teaching spaces where they've had integrated studies units in the junior years, so English and history and geography and everything is put together, it seemed to me that geography was losing out there. That some of the geography that was included was often chosen because it fitted in more easily with the history or other aspects, and things like cloud formations and other stuff that was fun just seemed to be pushed. Has that?
Yeah, I think from the work that I've done and the readings that have been part of, my direct pool, it's the interdisciplinary nature of geography that, as a science and a social science, that becomes challenging in school settings, because it's written as curriculum and it's, organised in faculty structures as a subject of the humanities and social sciences. And the science aspect of it can get lost when you don't necessarily have the geography specialised teachers on that. So I think that's a contributing factor, a structure that affects the way in which geography is taught before you layer out of field teaching on top of that. Yeah.
So I reckon I was a pretty good English teacher. It was the only thing that interested me, and I thought I did it really well. I taught out of field twice in 2 main times in my teaching career. Both were in humanities, and it wasn't as a new teacher. So I'd been teaching for about 10 years, and it was just awful. What it does to your understanding of you as a teacher, that inability to follow a red herring or to be able to respond to a student because you didn't have that background. I mean, they could throw almost anything at me in an English class and I'd be able to work out a way of pulling it back to where it needed to be. But in Canadian history 1 year and another history unit, I always felt that that my students were being sort of sold short, that I wasn't giving them the best of what they needed. And that was particularly sort of had an impact on my sense of myself as a teacher. Both you, Susan, particularly, I noticed, are working with how do teachers, when they move into the profession, with the understanding that they might be teaching out of field and they don't have all of those things. What do you think that does to teacher retention? Briefly, and then we're going to move on to what can we do.
Linda, would you like to answer this as well? Shall I go first and then throw to you, or would you like to answer that?
You go.
All right. So I think it has quite a significant component to play in a decision to leave the profession.
Yeah.
And I know whilst my particular group in both my PhD and the group I'm working with now stayed in the profession and found a way around it and accepted that out of field teaching was a reality of their teaching life. We know from the literature that, you know, it plays a part in a decision to leave. And I guess that's where, you know, the summit that was held a year and a half ago now, maybe, and the report that emerged from that really had some strong recommendations for initial teacher education-led research to happen, so that we can start to sort of familiarise the pre-service teacher group with the fact that it's likely to happen, and perhaps these are some strategies to employ. I think that might be one way around it, but I also know Linda's probably got some ideas and comments to add to that as well.
Oh, yeah, well, I think it really comes down to support. I mean, I've done various research where you've looked at, I've followed teachers along from coming out of university. So a longitudinal study, interviewed them at university and then for another 3 years. And obviously there's different trajectories for teachers. Some, they go in and out of field. They learn from being out of field. And they take that with them into their in-field areas. They might leave a school so that they can actually be teaching in-field. And so you've got this, it's a very dynamic space, and particularly for early career teachers, a lot are employed specifically to fill the gaps. And there is this doing their time, this expectation that out of field teachers will learn by doing this. And I think that's a practice that really needs to be looked at severely. And one of the suggestions we had from that report that we put together following this national summit on teaching out of field that Susan referred to was to really reconsider this practice of assuming that early career teachers, graduate teacher, can fill the gaps of the timetable, because it is really challenging. Look, I don't see any actual analysis of data that shows a direct link between teacher attrition and out of field teaching, but it's all part of that mix that Ruth was talking about, of this challenging space of teaching that really does require support. And one thing that's missed, I think, in the conversation about how we attend to it is the leadership, the role of school leadership, because, and also the policy around the time that new teachers have. So, you know, a new teacher really needs time to not just learn the content, and because I teach it, I'm actually in science, and, you know, I've never learned physics in my life, and yet I have to go and teach it. So even in my area, in my in-field area, I still have a lot of learning to do as a new teacher. And so teaching a whole new subject out of field is just enormous.
Okay, so when I was doing some research for our for one of our programs, I came across, getting back to what you mentioned, Texas, in Florida, if a teacher is put into an out of field class, they must do, I think it's a 6-month unit in the by the end of that first year, or before they can go do any more, they have to have completed a university level 6-month unit in the subject that they're now teaching. So they need to go back. It's a requirement. Michaela, you run a company where you look at using technology to assist with maths teaching. I don't know whether that is something that would help. What are some of the technologies that we have that could help us with, or help us as we support out of field teachers in the classrooms?
So with maths teacher circles, our technology component is actually just about bringing teachers closer together.
Okay.
You mentioned at the start that we were formed in 2020, and for many of you, that year will ring a bell for a number of reasons. Maths Teacher Circle started as a face-to-face professional learning program, but we quickly pivoted online because of the COVID situation. And in hindsight, this has brought enormous benefits for teachers right across Australia. I've had teachers from Rockhampton to Broome to Warrnambool and Mount Gambier participate in our professional learning sessions who otherwise wouldn't get easy access to subject-focused professional learning on a regular basis. So from that perspective, technology is a great enabler, and I believe similarly for out-of-field teaching, there is a huge potential there to leverage that and to have more subject-focused PL specifically designed for out-of-field teachers. A lot of it is designed through universities or in capital cities, places that make it harder for certain people to come along. And going back to what I mentioned before about pockets of the country or certain socioeconomic communities being more affected by out-of-field teaching, they're not always in positions where that PL is readily available. So we do have a real opportunity through technology to make more available.
Lucinda and
Yes.
Ruth, sorry, I didn't notice their hand raising thing. Sorry, Lucinda.
Yeah, Ruth, I know you had your hand up before, Ruth, so I'm sorry to jump in ahead of you.
That's
But
okay.
just follows directly on from what Michaela said, in that I would say that the most valuable technology related thing that an English teacher can do in Victoria and in some other states where this is the case as well is to become part of the Professional English Teachers Association networks. We've got these amazing, vibrant, alive, supportive, collaborative, collegial networks that are pumping out ideas and resources and just morale boosting support on a daily basis. They have academics on them, they have practicing teachers, retired teachers. It's a really fabulous sort of community. So I think that idea of technology is a way to bring people together. And yet you've got to ask, inside schools, do those out-of-field teachers have the same kind of access to the knowledge about the institutional membership of professional subject associations? And, do they receive the emails that people get and all that kind of thing? Does the head of English disseminate things well enough to them and all that kind of thing? So there's a rider on it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask if we've got time about the cost involved in some of these, particularly, you've put your hand down, Ruth.
There you go. You're still there.
So, sorry. Okay, you first.
As a middle leader, one of the things that we budget for is professional memberships. So Maths Teachers Association of Queensland, and we always send people away to conferences. The English Teachers Association, Geography Teachers Association, the History Teachers Association, there's a lot of associations that we're members of. One of the things that we have on our professional learning form when we send people away to conferences and things like that is that it's an expectation that when you come back you share what it is that you learn, so that it's not just of benefit to one or two people, it's actually of benefit to the whole community. I was actually thinking about the notion of support, and I've worked a lot with beginning, and I still work a lot with beginning teachers as well as pre-service teachers in the school. And I think there needs to be greater connection between universities and schools, looking at the continuum of support that teachers get. I do a lot of coaching within the school, so that's bespoke professional learning within within classrooms, and my role is often generalised pedagogy around routines and processes. And I'm a middle year specialist, so it's assumed that I can teach almost anything. So I work with a lot of teachers, but there are cases where I have to send them off in the direction of the head of department for maths, for example, or for science, simply because I don't have the pedagogical or the content knowledge to be able to support those people. We have, of course, the provisional to full registration processes which align with the AITSL standards. But I think in schools, sometimes it's assumed that when you do that, that's the end of support. I think we need to be looking at support that commences at the beginning of the pre-service teaching learning and continues all the way through until at least the 5th year, because, you know, many of the teachers are leaving within the first 5 years of that of the profession. So there are so many different contributing factors. I'm at a public school, so you know, all of the complexities that go along with that. Teachers need support in terms of how to manage workload, how to plan effectively, what's the architecture of the curriculum looks like within the pedagogical framework of the school. So there needs to be specialised support within the school, but that can also be supported by more generalist, it's the incorrect word, but more generalised help within the subject area or within particular aspects of their practice, which can be achieved by technology. For our our teachers who are newly arrived into Education Queensland, we've actually got a technology-based package put out by Education Queensland, which works them through all of the generic processes and things like that and the expectations. And they have the ability to connect there online with a mentor. So if mentoring isn't offered within the school per se, they actually have the ability to connect virtually with technology to a mentor who can actually discuss with them, you know, the problems or the challenges that they face as new teachers to Education Queensland. And that's not just for beginning teachers, that's for anybody who's onboarding into Education Queensland, because systemically there are so many different complexities. If you move from CathEd to Education Queensland to another independent school, or even within Education Queensland schools, there's a lot of individualized complexity at schools. And we often find that, you know, people trying to get their heads around, well, how do all the systems and processes within the school work? How does all of the timetable and all of that sort of stuff work? Who do I need to see if I need to refer people? All of that sort of stuff, in addition to, well, how does the curriculum work? What's the pedagogical framework look like? And if you then add, well, I've got this class in this subject that it's completely out of field, that can be the straw which really breaks the camel's back in some circumstances. So I think that notion of support and how we approach and tailor support, both internally within the school, externally, and the connections with universities is really critical.
Linda, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And it's great to hear so many different resources being provided both in the school as well as from the education department and from subject associations. And a lot of it is tailored towards new teachers or new to a subject. But one thing that I would like to raise is that while professional learning is often offered, there are a number of reasons why out-of-field teachers don't engage with professional learning in their out-of-field area. One of them is because they don't actually want to be known as a teacher of that subject. So they will not undertake any professional learning activities that actually elevate them into that role. Another reason is because there can be barriers at the school level where either professional learning has to be, well, it's always approved at the school, and sometimes you hear people say, oh, I wasn't allowed to do that because it's not my subject area and my principal wouldn't allow me. So there are a number of barriers that are preventing that. On the other side of that, the flip side of that is you hear stories of principals saying, okay, you're teaching out of field in that, go and do some professional learning, go be part of the sort of curriculum review panels, go and be part of the teachers in rural schools who come together to moderate their papers, and they learn from each other in those sort of spaces. So there's lots of those informal learning opportunities outside of professional learning and outside of resources that teachers can engage with in order to sort of build their capacity and their confidence to be able to see themselves as part of that, that community of practice.
Everyone, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to go at 1:30 because I have another meeting, but I just wanted to jump in and say something about AI and generative AI, in case people are thinking about that in relation to technology, because that's my specific area of expertise. Some people might be thinking generative AI could be a great support to out-of-field teachers because they could use it for lesson planning, they could use it to research, so to speak, areas of the discipline and that kind of thing. But I would just like to wave a really big red flag about this, because I've done a lot of pushing of generative AI to produce lesson plans and things, and it produces very dull, very formulaic lesson plans. And I think everybody needs to keep at the forefront of their mind that things like ChatGPT are giant cliche machines, and they are not going to produce necessarily good practice, good pedagogy or things like that. And they may, further disengage kids from classes while they can do useful things, reminding you to have an introduction to your lesson that maybe links to prior learning or things like that. Some triggers. They really are highly problematic, and in many ways there's actually no ethical way to use them given how they're trained, the stolen corpus of material they're trained on, and that kind of thing. So I think the whole situation with AI is going to add another layer of complexity. How can this be used ethically in each discipline, both by teachers and by students in activities in the classes? So the only thing that I've found it is quite handy for is these sort of just-in-time resources, where a kid says to you, but why, show me how a topic sentence can go in different places all throughout a paragraph, not just at the start. And you can go, well, bang, on the screen, ChatGPT or whatever, that here you go, here are the 3 sentences with the same topic sentence positioned different ways. So it can be handy perhaps for things like that, but it's really problematic.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Lucinda. It's been really
Thank you.
to have
Thank you for having me along.
And I look forward to talking to you more about English.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Linda and Susan now, I guess. We talked briefly, I mentioned about doing the unit of study in the new area with universities. The idea of a teacher maybe getting a micro-credential, how could universities perhaps, I'm just thinking about departments at universities and how they're organized, and how would they look at being able to offer a qualification for just a unit, for instance, in a particular subject. And you're smiling and saying, how long's a piece of string?
Yeah, well, look, there's a few things I'd like to say about that. Being qualified, it's an interesting thing, because just bearing in mind that there are no registration processes in any state apart from New South Wales that recognise teacher methods and what subjects they're qualified to teach. And so a lot of this becomes problematic, because there is a strong culture within schools of learning on the job without having to go back to university to get an additional qualification. Why would I do that? I can learn on the job. I've been doing it for 20 years. I'm doing it for 5 years. But I think this is changing a little bit, just because there are funded opportunities that are coming up. And universities are being part of this. So graduate certificates, for example, there are a few of those around the country that give teachers a qualification in the particular area that they're teaching out of field in. So Deakin runs they're going to have 4 actually. Part of the issue there is that often teachers don't want to do a 4-year, whole year, sort of potentially 2 years graduate certificate, even when the government pays for them to do the course, and even when the school receives CRT coverage for them. So huge resources, for example, have been thrown into some graduate certificates by the Victorian government, and we just can hardly get teachers to do it. So there is something happening in the culture within the profession that says we don't need this, or now is not the time, you know, and maybe a bit later, and just not yet. The other option of micro-credentials or MOOCs, yeah, they're all things that are sort of already happening. I spoke to someone the other day from another university who's inquiring doing some micro-credentialing in this space. And that would probably involve micro-credentials that would then articulate into some Master of Education degree. So there are some practices and models that are emerging now, because schools are, universities, schools of education or faculties are recognising that they do have a part to play in dealing with this.
So being aware of your time and being very grateful for your generosity in giving it, is there one last thing that, what single last thing that you would like to say about the out-of-field teaching profession and an idea for making it easier for teachers who are in that in that position?
If it's okay, I might go first.
Okay.
One of the things that I encourage all pre-service teachers to do when they come to our school is to see as wide a variety of subjects as possible. They might not have space in their timetable. Sorry, they usually have some space in their timetable. So if that's the case, what we try to do is arrange a whole heap of different subjects that they could be interested in. Let them know that out-of-field teaching is probably going to happen for them, and that it actually increases their chances of employment if they say yes. So what are they happy to teach? Let's go arrange for them to go and teach that. We also have a program of watching others work at our school. So seeing other teachers in action and taking notes according to, a pro forma that we have about what do you see, what do you think, and what do you wonder? And then reflecting on that in terms of their own practice, so they can go and watch other people in the classroom. Our beginning teachers in the first 6 months have a line off at our school, and it's expected that it gives them time to work out their workloads, familiarise themselves with what's going on, but also to go and observe other teachers and to see what's going on in other people's classrooms, and listening to their voices about what they need in terms of support, and being able to connect them with that support is really, really important.
Cool. Linda?
I would like to make a suggestion around another way technology can be used, which is to help ascertain the risk and the potentialities of, capacity building around this. So having some sort of tool that, in a sense, highlights some things that that for the individual teacher, but then have a conversation around that with leadership around how can we manage. So those things that you were talking about before then, Ruth, is terrific, and if you could have some some data or some sort of tool to support that conversation, I think that would be terrific. And we're doing something like that. It's based on the definition that we've done for the Victorian Department, and it's actually been utilised in another research project that we're going to, so that's going to be reported to our out-of-field collective symposium in a few weeks. So it's, I think, something like that, just to help, because teachers often don't feel like they can actually say no to principals as well. So something to facilitate that conversation, I think, is really important.
Susan?
So I guess I'd like to say that being informed is being forewarned. So I guess I'd like to say that increasingly out-of-field teaching is becoming a reality of being in the profession for all of us. I think we've all here experienced it in some way throughout our career. Pre-service teachers, I'm sorry to say it, but you're going to experience it as well. But there are steps that you can take to build your capacity and to manage and respond to the situation. And those communities of practice that exist online, whether that come through subject-specific professional association-led work, or university or school network hub-led work, there's a variety of things that you'll be able to tap into to help support you through the process.
And Michaela?
I think the thing that is coming to mind for me here is around leadership, in particular middle leadership, and the pivotal role that they have to play in schools where there are out-of-field teachers. Ruth, you mentioned a lot about all of the sorts of supports that are going on in your school. And it sounds honestly incredible. And that's not something that I think is widespread, purely because a lot of middle leaders don't have the time to provide all of that. So we're talking about coaching, but we're also talking about things like resource development and all of the kinds of bread and butter activities that need to go on in a department that then get thrown onto a smaller pool of teachers when you've got out of field teaching happening, because those out of field teachers are generally going to be putting the main part of their efforts into their primary subject. So I really think that we've got to think not just about those out of field teachers, but then the others who are implicated in that, the teaching of those subjects.
Thank you all very much. It's an interesting thought to be moving forward with, the idea that it's going to become more common in almost every subject. And how do we make sure the money is available to provide the resources needed by teachers? And I think not just in the cities, but in those remote areas of which Australia has a large number of teachers who, I was talking to I think primary head, who said that about 40% of his staff were new teachers in a rural setting, and he's constantly looking for things he could do to assist that. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your work in this area and all that you do to support our teachers, who then can support our students more fully. Yes, thank you again, Susan, Michaela, Ruth, Linda, and Lucinda. Your details and your not your contacts, I'm not going to do that to you. Your details are, as people will have seen in the event information. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn.